Hello, welcome to LGIU's Fireside Chats, a new interview series for our Future Local Lab program. We're joined by guests from around the world to discuss what the future holds for local government, with the emphasis firmly on what the sector can do now to start preparing for that future. Today, I'm joined by Dominic Campbell, somebody I've known for nearly 2 decades, which seems kind of unbelievable, but is true. But I haven't seen in a while, so this is a genuinely really real pleasure for me. Dominic is a longtime public service innovator with experience spanning local government leadership in the UK, US, and Australia, digital transformation at national scale and obviously local scale, and now public interest entrepreneurship in the US. He's the founder of FutureGov, a partner at the venture studio Impossible Ideas, and a former fellow at Georgetown's Beak Center. We're going to talk about tech, pace, power, what public service really means, and maybe even a little bit of football chat. Hello, Dom. Good to see you.
Hey, great to see you. My gosh, 2 decades. Yes, that's flown by.
I know.
But great to see you again.
Yeah, indeed. So let's roll back those decades, Dom, and let's start. You've done a lot of different things over the years with some consistent themes: local government leadership, running a startup, now investing in others doing that work. So when you look back, maybe in childhood, I don't know, was there a moment where you thought, yeah, this is it. This is what I want to make my life's work?
Yeah, I mean, interesting. I did a TEDx talk back in Birmingham where I grew up, not a few years back, and it was only hard. You can see halfway through my talk this realization that I have that I was sort of highly institutionalized in terms of my aspirations, as I talk about how I went to a red brick school, a red brick university, and as a child went from wanting to be a priest to wanting to be chief executive of Birmingham City Council, all in the space of a couple of years as a teenager. And so I think that's probably the backbone of it. I mean, I later found out that my great granddad ran the bus company on Teesside. So there's obviously something in the air in my family around public service and government and local areas looking to get into that line of work. So I can truly say, age 13, my aspiration was to be not the mayor, not the leader, but the chief executive of Birmingham City Council. That's how nerdy I have been. So 30 years later, I've never quite reached that aspiration, but I've certainly worked in and around that space plenty to experience it. I think the interesting thing for me was that I went into local government straight out of university. And I think my view was that it was going to be sort of a hotbed of social activism, quite naively. I think my impression was probably founded more by the sort of community organizing, maybe even councillor side of things without realizing, rather than the managerial side, and found a lot of love and respect for the managerial side and the bureaucratic side and how we need that to keep the lights on, to make sure that we've got stability in our communities. But I think for me, it was always this tussle between, am I a bureaucratic entrepreneur or an entrepreneurial bureaucrat? And I've sort of been dancing on both sides of that line ever since, I think.
So I really got caught up with that priest to chief executive thing. And
and now atheist, what can you do?
What can you do?
But as I say, highly institutionalized. I see myself as quite rebellious, but it was only when I was doing that talk that I realized quite how shaped I'd been by sort of those fundamental British institutions and values. So I guess it is that combination of sort of, which I guess I've pulled into work at FutureGov and elsewhere, is about understanding the system enough to be able to shape the system and to push the boundaries of the system, which I think is, maybe it's something we'll talk about, just about how you get that balance right and when looking to make change. So I think having that foundation's useful as long as you have that sort of rebellious soul within you as well.
Yeah, I guess thinking about it, is the theme pushing the boundaries rather than breaking the system for you throughout your
Yeah, I think so. I think the people who understood the work of FutureGov well, and particularly as we matured as an organization and just stopped being, I could see how we might be seen as a bit too pushy or a bit like arrogant at first in terms of like trying to disrupt. But myself and Carrie, who was co-director at the time, we had our grounding in having led large scale change in big organizations in local government. So hopefully people recognized over time that it was coming from a place of understanding, respect, but also a recognition always that I think we were always taking the outside in perspective. I think we always, it's very easy to get lost in the everyday life of large organizations. And I think that's true, for me, it's large versus small, not public versus private versus charity. It's, these large organizations, you inherently start navel gazing to some degree, and you look at your own processes, you look at your own internally on cost, but it's a real struggle to look from the outside and hold what the citizens really value at the center of your thinking every day. And I think that's probably the role we played best was, a level of respect for the system, a level of understanding for the lives that people were leading in government, but also saying, come on, I feel like we had a series of events at one point that were titled Expect Better. And I feel like that's sort of, when I look back now, that probably is the summary of my 20 years. Is like, whether you're inside or outside of government, we've got to raise our expectations. People are allowed to and deserve to expect better. And that's what we should always hold in our hearts.
Expect better. I like that. And we're going to explore exactly some of those boundaries between pushing and breaking, as we talk further. So you've worked in the UK, you've worked in the US. Obviously, we're both people on the wrong side of the Atlantic right now. But, have you noticed a difference? And let's not talk about say in the last 6 months or the last year or two, but in general, having worked across the two systems, what would you say was the best of both? And what do you think they
For
could
sure.
both do better?
Yeah, I mean, as someone who, my master's 20 years ago was focused on local government reorganisation and the introduction of mayors.
Plus a
So I was really
change,
focused.
yeah.
Yeah, I know, right? That was like 2002, and I was looking at the new mayor of Middlesbrough who'd come in as nicknamed RoboCop because he was a cop turned mayor, and so I definitely it's really nerdily interesting for me to live in a city with a very strong mayor that's always been that way, even though it has no representation at national levels. So we have taxation without representation in DC. Let's hope it'll be the 51st state one of these days. But it has been really interesting to see to actually get to. I'd worked a bit in federalized systems in both Germany and in more so in Australia prior to moving to the US. To see the benefits of that sort of devolution, not that they would understand it that way, it was just the way it was constituted, obviously 250 years ago. But devolution, tiers of government is really interesting to compare that to the reorganisation agenda in the UK at the moment. And I am a big fan. I do think there's a bit more logic to it in the US than what I'm seeing emerge in the very organic political way in the UK. I'll confess I'm not a massive strong regional mayor man. I'm much more into local mayors, and believe that there is a really strong role for strong leaders to sort of mediate between national, global capital and local needs and trying to advocate for place. I'm not sure the sort of, the money people of the US or anywhere, or the Middle East or anywhere else are particularly aware of what, South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire or anything else means compared to Leeds or Manchester or, some of these more naturally obvious economic units. So I do think that hopefully this is just a journey and things will clear their way through. But I think the US shows that local taxation, that sort of variety, the ability for Texas and Florida to compete with the rest of the US by having certain taxes rather than income taxes, for instance, that's a bit odd. I think the US is definitely more the European Union than it is sort of regionalized UK in how it rolls, because it's very odd for a nation to be competing with itself in that way. But I do see the benefits of it in terms of self-sustaining areas. When it comes to sort of things like information agendas and things like that, it's like living in the past in the US, if I'm being frank. To live in the country that is the home of so much of the technology we're all using, and the money that's funding it, yet for government just go and look, if anyone on this wants to go and look at Washington DC's website, you'll see, I think it won Best of the Web 2012, and I doubt it's been touched in the last 13 years. It's appalling. Like it's seen as very much probably what was going on in the e-government, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, in Naughty's agenda in the UK, which is essentially some digital is better than nothing. Let's buy a product and overlay it and plug it in, and then we can sit back and say we're modernized. Whereas obviously the UK has gone so much further. Last I looked, places like the Ministry of Justice have 200, 300, 400 people working just in their digital and design teams. That's not far off the grand total that the entire central team in the federal government has in the US. If you add it up, even before recent months, things like US Digital Service and 18F in the US, you're probably talking 400 people. GDS, I think, is about double that. We're talking about England being roughly equivalent to California, not the US. So the argument just hasn't been won here, I think, in terms of, what the potential in government can be. And I think that largely comes from perspective on government as well. The way I view government here is the economy and the private sector is seen as the sun, and the government circulates it out on some cold moon of Neptune somewhere. Whereas I think very much in Europe, government is seen as the base of a triangle and seen as sort of the fundamentals to allow us all to live our lives and the basis of an economy that can thrive. It's very much seen as a sort of an annoyance and a thing that gets in the way of earning money here. And I'm glad that that's not the case in Europe.
I mean, if you don't keep up with the times, then you are a bit of a hindrance to making money or living your life or achieving whatever it is that you want to do. I mean, I know that the amount of time it takes me to renew my son's US passport versus his UK passport, and the kind of hoops that I have to jump, like the digital element of that is download for 537F, and I showed up with a 537E, and I was sent away.
You'll be glad to know they're trialing the new digital service. But I mean, when did the UK one come in? 10 years ago, I
I
think.
mean,
Maybe 2017.
it's
So
just
like,
complete
yeah,
difference, complete difference. Well,
yeah,
it's
you're
not my
talking 10 years.
not my job to renew his passport anymore. He's turning 18. So, but yeah, I think I definitely can see, those kind of differences. What about the culture of local government? How would you say that's different
Yeah.
or the same?
I think it's more similar to how it is in Australia, inevitably, in terms of, I think one of the big challenges here is that there is a lack of language. I think Americans would call it like civics education, but it's more than that. Like it's a language around understanding government. And so people say they hate government. Almost across the board, people just hate government. And then you ask them what they mean, and you say, do you hate your teachers? Do you hate your arcs? And they say, no, but that's not government. That's not what I'm talking about. I hate government. And what you realize, they basically hate the people on Capitol Hill or the president. Whereas I find in Europe and the UK, we have more of a nuance. It's probably got worse, if I'm being really honest, but we have tended to have more of a nuance, in large part because of things like the NHS, I think, that is able to understand the difference between hating the government, national government of the day, and those are politicians. That
Mhm.
still doesn't mean you hate the passport agency. It just means you hate the people in Westminster.
I kind of hated the
And
passport agency when they sent me away, but yeah.
for a period, for sure. But at least you would understand that, I think, as public services rather than just this nebulous like government concept. And I think that's a real struggle in the US when it comes to local as well, because people don't differentiate between, strangely, to
Yeah.
some degree, like tax collection, federal government, waste collection. I mean, so much of it here is outsourced as well that they probably don't even know that their taxes fund waste collection because it's just got a private contractor's name on the side of the truck, maybe. But I find it it's very much an economic development function, is what people would view it as.
Hmm.
A lot of the welfare stuff, they definitely do child protection. They obviously fund schools, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the thing that is front and center is the economic development side of things, which is ironic because that's where I came into local government in the UK, was very much at a time when I remember in Barnet, we had 100 economic development officers that only lasted till, I think, a year or two of my career before they were down to like 3 or 4. But there was a point at which we understood local government to be important in the economy, and that therefore the economy would drive tax receipts and therefore drive funding of local and national
Mhm.
government. But that seems to have been lost. And maybe that is a good thing about this mayoral devolution agenda. But a lot of that's been now done at sort of sub-regional, regional level, and local government could risk going into a sort of more Australian model, which is essentially customer service, bins, housing, more like but said with love for districts, but purely district council level functions, and people lose some of the understanding around child protection, education, adult social care, which may not be there already, to be honest. But so many of those functions are delivered at state and national level in the US
Mhm.
that they're not. There's that lack of connection, I think, between public value in the US because everything's quite remote from people. And I think it would be a real shame if we were to follow too far down that track, because I think on the whole, people understand at the very even at the lowest, people understand and value the role of councils in child protection and other things that keep the show on the road in the UK. And so I'm nervously watching where things settle down in England in particular.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I think it's complicated where some of those services, I mean, it's complicated here in the UK where those services are set, but I think a little bit maybe more complicated across the piece. But like I'm from a small town, and because it's a small place, and you know who the people are, and you know their kind of dedication to local issues, and it may be in different places there's a kind of different idea
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
who and what.
I mean, what's the number? I mean, depending how you count it, people say something like 30,000 sub-federal agencies in the US. So like, and some of them,
Mhm.
I love the very loose use of the word city in the US. I remember
Oh
going
yeah.
to what I would call a beach resort, a population 700 being called City of something in Oregon, and falling off my chair as someone with a geography degree and appalled at the misuse of the term city compared to the
Eh,
Royal Charter in the UK.
eh. I mean,
But yeah, but it gives opportunity for that proximity for sure that you're describing. I think we're at risk, and I can see the pushback from districts there and elsewhere
mm,
in terms of fears around some of that, or even should Surrey be one or two organisations? Well, even two is absolutely enormous and quite
it's
distant
quite
from
big.
people's everyday lives. So it's definitely something we need to watch out for, and what that it definitely it gives a opportunity. I think it's something that I would love to see more of through this process is a real reboot of our institutions in a way, because the superstructure could be enormous. That's fine to some degree, as long as we're smart about not necessarily putting in place the 5 districts that are going or whatever, but I think, I mean, councillors, you could argue to some degree, came about before customer service as a function, before social media, before much easier ways to engage with citizens. And I'm not arguing necessarily that we don't need 3 councillors per ward. I probably would argue that, if I'm being honest, because of those things that mean that the role is fundamentally different. But it's a bit like we'll probably talk about with AI to some degree. Like, what is the load that institutions and technology can be taking that once were held by local politicians, to free them up to do the strategic, to do the things that only humans can do? And I think we're not quite in thinking in that space. And that doesn't necessarily have to be determined by the size of a local government organisation. It can be designed in, even within an enormous organisation, if we're deliberate about it. But I do think that connection is key, and too often what I'm seeing in these restructures is a sort of big four mindset of sort of, combine, restructure, transform plan, which I've seen written time and time again. And that happens over 5 years. And of course, if you're lucky, you get to modernisation, but you absolutely never get to transform. And in many respects, you could argue that transform should come first, because I know we're obsessed with safe and stable when we're combining our organisations. But you can do that while simultaneously saying about how should this really be done. It's a once in a lifetime opportunity, once in a 50-year opportunity for us to actually say these organizations were built for 1970, whatever the last
Mhm.
restructure was. What should we be doing in 2025 with the tools that we've got available to us? And at the moment, I'm sad to see the focus is mostly on just smashing organizations together and hoping 2 wrongs make a right, rather than creatively thinking about how do we really want to work? How should we be working?
I mean, I think it's not even, it doesn't even appear to be most of the question on this one, on this reorganization. So I'm going to ask you one. I didn't think we were talking reorg today, but it's on our people's minds.
Such an opportunity, though, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, yeah. But as a geographer, so just think about it that way. This connection with place, like how much does that matter in terms of this reorganization? Like, is that, do you think it matters to people's identity, to people's connection with the institution?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's, as I said before, like I feel like there's an obsession of baking in everything to the institution rather than thinking about what are we trying to achieve. So, if you want somewhere abstract that has never really existed called Northamptonshire to exist, or I don't think that we created that one, did we?
Yeah.
Anyway, um, If we're going to create these abstractions, like I was saying, earlier as well, I grew up at a time post West Midlands, I think, when I was in Birmingham, but you still talk about it 50 years later. So they're things and they capture people's imagination, or they stick at least. But the institution behind that is one thing. How we then want to achieve like for the community is something completely different. And, there doesn't have to be, we don't have to force people to understand that, like it's Conway's law. Like just because we decided that the institution looks that way, we then spew it up on a website and say, this is how we're structured. Click one of these tabs. And it's like, I don't know the difference between social services and democratic council. Just talk to me like I talk to you as a human. And so I think that's where things are getting trapped a little bit. I think we need highly functioning, highly efficient, highly modern institutions that have brilliant technology, brilliant ways of working, underlying a whole plethora of operating models and ways of delivery that aren't even delivered necessarily or designed necessarily at a children's services level or an adult social care level. We always come in with 2x2 matrices and say, which of these operating models is the council? Okay, the council has 153 services, say.
Hmm.
Each of those should, have its own way of delivering. And it may be that they're grouped into 6 different ways of working. Some are about, can best be delivered by top-down rigid services. Child protection probably falls into that category. Or some of the regulatory services where it's 100% in the wheelhouse of councils to be responsible for those outcomes. There might be other operating models that are partnership delivered, where bits of them are transactional and bits of them are strategic, where the council has to have the knowledge, but not necessarily the operational delivery. And then there's other bits that might be just matchmaking. It might be saying, we've got the best view of an area. We're probably the only body that sees all of Surrey, and therefore we're going to matchmake. And economic development's probably a good example of that,
Hmm.
maybe. But I think equally, like community engagement it needs for me, it's almost like a reimagining of this sort of institutional capacity and capability. Like it's so often just seen over here, rather than it's actually weirdly for me a bit closer to IT, HR, customer service. Like these are all cross-cutting capabilities that enable both service delivery and community empowerment to happen through those different ways of delivering for people. But I've very rarely seen, slash never, in my career seen a creative articulation of that. It's very much like, these are the silos we have. We design singularly for this service, then we'll, at the end of it, commission IT to buy us the least awful system that exists on the market that was designed for a world 20 years ago that doesn't meet our needs. And then we'll change our service to do what the technology says to do. And that's totally ridiculous. So a lot of it for me is around creativity and confidence. I think we lack confidence a lot of the time to actually say, we know what we're doing. We know the best way to achieve outcomes. We're going to make the market, whether it's daycare providers or technology providers, do what we ask to change creatively and meet what we think is the right design solution for our people, because we're listening really well. And it's that confidence that I really do think we lack sometimes. And that, some people might laugh at me because they've got very bold leaders or whatever else. But a lot of the time, what I'm seeing from that leadership is best guesses, or they heard an idea from somewhere else and they're going to impose it on their place, rather than truly, is this informed by what you're seeing and hearing locally? So for me, it all inevitably, that complexity mixes together.
Okay, well, I'm gonna flip that around a little bit and say, like from government saying to tech, we've been talking to the people and we've been working with them. We know what they want to. Now we've got a situation in the U.S. where we've got maybe some well-funded tech guys who are coming in and saying this is how you run government. And this is a dark vision. I think we're both technology enthusiasts, so don't get me wrong, but
No, completely.
it's when these tech folks come in and maybe have little respect or knowledge for the reality of governance, or that AI can replace civil servants. What do we need to do to make sure that if someone comes in, if you bring in a technology partner, that they're doing it to serve the public good?
Completely agree. No, I agree completely. And I think this is a really good example of like why the UK is in a better place for this change in the long run than the US, from my experience, because as I say, the lack of skills, experience, capacity within the US system and this sort of worshipping at the altar of Silicon Valley has led to this, or has definitely contributed strongly to the dark pattern that you're describing, because they were able to roll through these institutions quite quickly and easily because there wasn't a large enough, well-informed enough collection of civil servants in place to be able to back some of that pressure and to say you're breaking the law, or we're already on the case, so don't do that because we're on the front foot already. It created this, there's a long time of under delivery and change in the system in the US. So the population were willing to vote for a sledgehammer or a chainsaw, as he chose as his metaphor. And whereas in the UK, I know I've seen the local results recently, and I know that there is a strong upswell in radicalism. Interestingly, from the side that calls itself conservative, both in the US and the UK, is now the radicals. But interesting twist of history the change appetite is there, but I think the majority comparatively in the UK is in a strong place to say things are moving forward. That's slow, but we value this foundation. Whereas, as I said earlier, like government isn't respected, it isn't seen as foundational in the same way, and it's been ushered in. And there is an awful lot of power in the system from people with money. Whereas the UK, I see like the AI, I can't remember what it's called, is it AI.ai, I.ai? The civil service AI prototyping lab is getting on the front foot. There's still some challenges there. I think there's very,
Mhm.
very few people at the top table in the UK who really understand this. There's one guy from the outside who's part of the global tech pro elite who seems to be the main advisor, the sole advisor to some degree. And I think that is risky.
Mhm.
But we have thousands of modern data and AI and technology professionals in our civil service. What I don't see in either country is at a local level, anybody waking up and investing at the level that they really need to. Because cards on the table, I do believe there needs to be a massive shift towards AI-driven public services that will inevitably shed a huge amount of jobs of certain types, of the ones where robots do it better than humans.
Mhm.
And even Karl Marx, right, wrote about how technology was could either emancipate or enslave the masses. And I think we're seeing both of those things happen at the same
Mhm.
time right now. And if we don't get on the front foot, it'll be the second one. If we get on the front foot, I really think it can be the emancipation of people. One of the things that I've invested in it's called Magic Notes, is a voice to text to case note technology that is giving a day a week back to social workers. Like that just can't be bad. At the very least, they might work a 40-hour week instead of a 50-hour week as a result, which is great for retention, great for vacancy rates, great for mental health. But we need to make sure that we understand the technology. We need to make sure we've got the right people in the system to act on behalf of government and public good. And I don't think we're anywhere near that. It's still a head of IT 3 layers down who gets tossed a task, who then isn't incentivized to employ people at the right level to help them understand things properly.
Yeah, I think so. One of the things that I worry about, I guess, when I'm feeling existential dread is this kind of, a lot of the people who are advocating some of the things that I'm actually a big fan of in lots of ways seem to hold some like really sketchy political views, libertarian to the, like who cares about the peasants kind of level of libertarianism to, kind of very authoritarian views. And when you're like, partnering with either a big company, mainly maybe that, how do public servants navigate this kind of tension and make sure they're not sort of, allying with,
Yeah.
I don't know,
Yeah,
let's
the
bring
wrong
back
forces. Yeah,
apartheid
yeah.
stuff.
No, I
Yeah.
agree. I agree. I agree. I think in terms of it's very hard, but I mean it's the way we've done it forever. It's very, I remember going through various procurements where I would advise even from the inside to bake in culture, values, think like proxies as well, like data ownership.
Hmm.
Like if a provider is willing to admit that it's your data and not theirs, and not charge you for access to your own data, which is rare, then they're the wrong, got the same values alignment because the data is not theirs. The software might be, but not the data. Because otherwise you end up with these relationships with people like Palantir in the US, who are certainly at the wrong end of the spectrum and are in the NHS actually. But I think a lot of, I think, I did some work back in the day in FutureGov in Australia around the new child protection system for New South Wales. And while I wanted them to build their own system so that they had full transparency, the thing that interests me is
Hmm.
councils generally would never imagine not being involved in the design of their new town hall. They would never say, here's a very high level aspiration we have, go away, design it and build it, and we'll only come when we get the keys. When it comes to technology, that's exactly what they're doing. They're
Hmm.
like, I don't need to see the software. I don't need to understand how this thing works. I don't need to even own my own desk in the building, my own data. All the contents will be yours when the lease ends in 10 years. Like,
Yeah.
what are you even talking about? So for me, like you can understand in that project in New South Wales, we started with values and user insight and created top 10 value sets, like in terms of how we wanted the supplier to behave and how we wanted to experience that relationship and then put it out to market and it becomes a requirement. Whereas too often we start with who's bought one of these systems before? Can we copy and paste their procurement?
Hmm.
And do we get the same system as them for slightly less price? And it's not the way to do things.
Yeah. So exploring that a little bit, if I was buying a big system, and I know that, people are pressured, people are really busy, and there is a tendency for maybe leaders who don't understand technology very well to be like, well, doesn't the company just do those things, make those decisions, or don't they know what they're doing with the tech? How do you, if you're, mid-level or, how do you push back on that? How do you say no, we need to understand how this works and we need to be accountable for how it works.
Completely. I mean, I think it's the hardest thing. I think it's the absolute hardest thing. It was always, when I was doing consulting, I would, and often it would be because I know senior level leaders in the sector, and so we'd be brought in enthusiastically at the top. But then you would end up being in the workshop with the people doing the delivery who might not they wouldn't know who you were, they wouldn't know why you'd been imposed on them. And so often I would close the door and say, okay, look, I know you have been advocating for change. I know you know the answer. We all know how this game works. The outsiders are listened to often more than the people on the inside. You tell me, we'll work together, we'll both do our thing. You know where all the skeletons are, you know how to make change happen. I know how to persuade the budgets and the powers that be to align with what we're trying to achieve. That was one group of people. There is definitely a very strong and powerful inertia-led group of people who have made their careers being the Mosaic guy or the Microsoft Teams guy, who sometimes you feel wish were working for the supplier more than the council because they're so precious about the systems, because it's defined their careers. And that
Mhm.
force is very, very strong. And very hard to, the risk of moving is 1,000 times higher than the risk of not moving in people's minds in this side of things. Because we've had disasters, and I understand that, but we've partly had disasters because we haven't done it the right way. And so it becomes a bit chicken and egg. Like if you invest in the right mindsets and capabilities, you're going to get the right outcomes more often than not. It is possible. But I do think a lot of it is around partnering, and it doesn't have to be with externals, but partnering with other people in the business. A creative, frustrated IT person finding a mid-level social work manager who desperately is advocating for change, which is what we saw in West London doing child protection there. We were lucky we had Claire, the DCS, a couple of mid-level and even entry-level, 20-odd-year-olds, entry-level social workers saying, are you kidding me? This is how I'm meant to work. um, Actually creating a sort of movement for change. I think there's a lot of room for, organizing approaches to be used in change management in organizations still, like, the way communities do. We don't view organizations like a community as much as we might in order to create, whatever it said, like 10 or 20% of people is all you need to start a movement. So if you find all the people who are willing to be part of the journey, and really advocate for outcomes rather than let's have a fight about Google versus Microsoft, because that's
Hmm.
a lost cause. then I think there's opportunity there.
Yeah, so we've talked about it from the local government side or the institutional side, but now you're investing in new agencies and startups that are working in this kind of public service field. And a lot of these things that you are working on touch really sensitive parts of people's lives, So we've talked about the child protection or social workers, but a lot of what local government does touches some areas of sensitivity in people's lives. So how do you make sure that the people that you're helping to fund or you're mentoring have that kind of public service ethos or values, company values that you would like to be partnering with if you were in local government?
Over the years, I've been, and those who know me who are watching this will probably laugh, but I've been very black and white. And like, the expect better thing I was talking about earlier is probably quite a good manifestation of that. Like, I'm like, it's either good enough or it's not good enough. And I think what I've grown into, not that I've accepted, but that I've grown into, is this grey area where, there is only, you can do a lot, but you can only go so far and you're restricted by the system around you. So, I've really enjoyed it. I've invested in about 8 startups now, everything from like planning technology to social care to a money app for immigrants and refugees, healthcare services for children. So, as you say, extremely sensitive. I've generally also been quite dismissive of bad privatization over the years as well. Um, Even in the IT space and the outsourcing, as you would imagine from what I was saying earlier about the lack of ownership of data and the behavior of some suppliers in taking advantage of the sector. So all of that combined has made it quite complex for my brain to totally understand the right way to do things and the right way to invest. So I started Impossible Ideas as a non-profit because previously I started FutureGov. I took investment from Nesta and from Surrey County Council. So a quarter of my company was owned by public and not-for-profit entities. And so I thought that safeguarded me against certain business models and certain approaches, but inevitably so much of it in this space is driven by growth and exit. And fine, I benefited from that. I also gave back Surrey and Nesta 3 times the money they gave me, so the public sector and others benefited from it. And so I see that as good. But where you end up is a public listed company, or you get owned by private equity, or venture capital has a certain rhythm to it. And so that side of things is the side that makes me that I'm most focused on at the moment, I would say, like how we change the money model and how we change the money system. Because at the moment, as much as I do work to get to know the founders, to make sure that they're driven by the right motivations, to ensure that they have the right safeguards built into their technology, things like data ownership being in the hands of the individual who is using the app, not the ownership of the company itself. And so that's essentially how I've seen it. The commitment, the values, the approach of the individual. The last piece of that puzzle I haven't resolved yet is all of them have taken angel or VC, venture capital investment. That money is impatient and at some point requires an exit. And you can do that by listing and becoming publicly traded, but that drives certain incentives for constant growth and profit margins, which has knock-on effects in terms of how much gets invested in the development of the technology, or how much do people care about customer service, or do they cut corners around data. There's different approaches and different routes to the future. What I can do is try and create part of the process at the moment as an angel investor to create these great new inventions. The bit that I'm then most intellectually concerned about is, what does the future of those organizations look like, and how do we maintain them to be in the public interest? And I think, Impossible Ideas was created through the partnership with 11 local authorities. They put the money in to help us design Impossible Ideas. And the intent was the pitch, which was due to be the day of lockdown 2020, where we had our posters up on the wall at Camden Council for the 11 councils to come and look at the pitch, said, we need to create a design hub, an incubator owned and for the sector. Please, would you put in another 100, 200,000 pounds so we can get this thing going, so that we can invent and spin out these technology and delivery companies who benefit you all without them having the distorting ownership of other parts of the economy. And so that remains a sort of itch in my head as something that desperately needs to be resolved so that we're in charge as a sector, not wider global capital movements, which can have detrimental effects on the lives of children in North London, which seems perverse.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess so. I guess there's no easy answer to that. And so maybe that goes back to that institutional question of these are the values that as a public sector organization we have to hold, and these are the suppliers that we choose and the contract that we hold them to around, the the bits that you can control, like who owns the data and is this, how transparent is the code, how transparent is the algorithm, or, what and how
Exactly that.
so, I mean, we've had long time kind of talking about loads of things, and barely even talked about the potential of AI to transform work in the public sector. So I'll keep it brief. And maybe we can come back and have another chat about the technical details. But if you're a high level manager or a political leader at a council, wherever you are, what should you be finding out about, and what should you be encouraging folks to look into and experiment with?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, my first thing would be to encourage curiosity. I know that chief execs are curious, and I know they have a lot of things that they have to be curious about. But we have to start to realize once and for all that every organization is a software organization. Like it is driving the behaviors, values, approaches of all service delivery. And until we just accept that fact, it's not for debate. It's just true. Go and sit over the shoulder of any of your employees and see what they're doing 7/10 of the week in terms of filling in boxes and being told what to do and what to say. These robots are super important, and they have been for 50 years. But what is about to happen will make the digital revolution of the last 20 years look like child's play. Taking a piece of paper and putting it on the internet. Well, try having 60,000 PhDs in a football stadium able to answer a question for you in less than a minute. It's slightly more radical in terms of what's possible. Or hollowing out what you thought was core to your being and your everyday work is suddenly gone, and you have to up your game. You have to think, what am I doing with that time? Like, what is it that is truly human and valuable that robots are going to be doing for me? And that, again, isn't, whether you like it or not, the systems are going to get this stuff put into them. You're not in control of that.
Mm-mm.
Microsoft have put it on Clippy 2.0 in terms of Copilot. You've got it, you're having it baked into all of your social care systems. But for me, it's about curiosity and understanding, podcasting, listen to podcasts, listen, reading, really understanding what the implications are going to be, because it's an HR issue, it's a legal issue, it's a finance issue. It's going to totally radically change how you think about your organization and the work that you do, and massively impact on the lives of the people that you're the custodian of as the chief exec or a leader of a council. And that's just not up for debate. The two big areas that I'm excited by are productivity on the one hand.
Mhm.
There's no doubt that it's the emancipation side of what Marx was hoping for. Instead of writing out a book by hand, you had a photocopier or a printing press. We're about to move into that space. We already are moving into that space. And so you need to see it creatively and optimistically as what can these humans do for us. Imagine if, I don't know, you say to me, you're doing this thing, you've got 2 days of your life back. I'd love you. What else would you like to do? Here's everything we do. Here's 152 services we deliver. Would you like to spend a day in a daycare center and a day out with like doing gardening in the parks? Imagine like what value you can bring to place with that time. If we all park our egos and our seniority and actually say, I quite create, that'd be quite nice. If I have a boring office job 3 days a week and I'm out and about helping the community the other two, if my salary and pension's protected. But there's real creative opportunities out there. The other one is that sort of 60,000 PhDs in a football stadium type of stuff. Being able to really interrogate data at a level that we've never seen before, to be able to join the dots, to be able to use things like agents in AI to get ahead of problems that we used to only respond to in a blue light fashion, to really help us understand trends in care, trends in health, trends in various different places, to help us solve problems before they become problems, without us even knowing that the problem's been solved potentially as well, because it's already been considered and acted upon before we've had to do anything. So for me, it's about, there really is not enough sort of creative design thinking going on in this space right now. There's a massive gap for people to look at it positively rather than how do we restrict Copilot? How do we, like, all that stuff is a different thing. That's everyday IT life. Who's doing the sort of speculative design? Imagine if, what does it look like for our workforce, institution shape, cost of delivery, problem solving capabilities? And that for me is something the sector could really, really do with.
Yeah, I've been absolutely amazed by what a fantastic creative partner it can be in terms of thinking through a lot of different problems. You know, but what we might have learned from, previous social media revolutions and stuff is that there's always a danger side too, and that we have to be cognizant of those dangers, or bad things could happen. Just be curious about the good and the bad, I guess, would be what I would say. It's been fantastic talking to you again, and it's reminded me what a great experience it is, and would love to talk more about how councils, how local government can harness some of these approaches to drive the change that's needed and resist the change that's not. But I'd like to, close on a note, like 10 years from now, in a hopeful sense, what 3 words would you like to be able to use to describe about local government?
There's so many different ones that I could
I
imagine
mean,
positively.
5. Go with 5.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm going to use one 3-word phrase, which is probably out of office. In terms of, I think so much of what we view as local government right now is ultimately just process. And for me, I think if we can get out of office, if we can really focus on the human to human relationships, that safeguards the future of local government. That's what makes it special. That's what it will help people understand where their money's going, what value is being created. People talk about their teachers, they talk about the person who cared for their elderly mother. They don't talk about, I'm afraid, those of us, me included, who do photocopying or typing numbers into boxes every day for a career. I think robots can do a lot of that. I really think if we can lean on that emancipation of local government through technology angle and get out of the office, be with the people we serve, then that would be an amazing outcome for local government.
It would be. Thank you. Yes, thank you again so much for coming along and having a chat today, and sharing your expertise with LGIU and with our members. And thanks to those who are out there listening and watching. And we'll be back soon with more intriguing interviews for the Future Local Lab. But in the meantime, you can find more at lgiu.org. Thanks, Dom.
Thanks so much. Bye.